Thank you, buddy. Yep, evening, guys. My name's Richie, recovered drug addict. Great to be here, and Tony, thank you for asking me to share. It's always a privilege and an honour, never a chore, to kind of be able to give back to the fellowship that kind of breathed new life into me and has given me so much. And I think whenever, personally, whenever I'm sat at the top table, I think I've got two main objectives. One, which is each group's primary purpose, and that's to carry the message to the still suffering addict. And the other is to try and give an adequate kind of demonstration of this program and what it's done for me in my life. And if I get that done, and it's job done, and off I go, with another day clean and sober under my belt. I just want to say a kind of big welcome to anybody that's new to Cocaine Anonymous. You might be thinking, oh my God, what has my life come to, sat in dark church halls, on a Thursday night. Don't worry, I felt like that as well, when I got here. But what I can resolutely say and kind of guarantee is, if you give yourself and continue to give yourself to this fellowship and this simple program of action, my experience has been I've never had to drink and use again. And, a big welcome to anybody that's back from a relapse. I think firstly, most importantly, well done for getting back, because many won't, and as I've been around, many haven't come back, so you guys are sat in here tonight, I would treasure your seats in Cocaine Anonymous, because I know for me and my experience, that didn't come cheaply. And, I didn't just use heavy for one weekend, and kind of ended up here. It certainly wasn't on, my life options when I left school, to become a drug addict and sit in the rooms, and sit in the rooms of CA and in cold church halls. Today, some of I've not just driven 5 minutes around the corner to get here tonight. I've been to work all day, poor me. And, as the day kind of went on, as some of you will know, my mind started saying, that was a stupid idea to agree to that share tonight. Don't you know how far it is from Swindon? You know what I mean? And then it said, you know what? You're not even going to get there anyway, because you've got to drive over Salisbury Plain and it's going to be flooded. Do you know what I mean? Which is probably nearer the truth, actually. But, what I do is, I don't tend to try and listen to that thinking anymore. Today it's just, a lot of it is just kind of nonsense, and I try and pause and kind of allow God to come in between, my self-centered, normally derived thinking about myself, and remember, what got me here, what keeps me here, and why I stay here, most importantly. And, I think it's important, I always make this kind of qualifying statement, because the truth of the matter is, drug addicts of my type, of my era, and how I use drink and drugs are a dying breed. That's the truth. Or we're either sat in here, or they're not very good in a good place out there. So I think it's important, as we know that, well, I certainly know that, excuse me, that, drug trends and the way people take drugs and the drugs people are using has changed quite considerably. And I think it's always important, and I always open with this, and I think it says at the bottom of page 33 of the big book, to be gravely affected, one does not necessarily have to have drank or used a long period of time, nor take the quantities some of us have. So in Cocaine Anonymous, we welcome the ketamine users, we welcome the Xanax poppers, we welcome the dope fiends. Do you know what I mean? We're in an all-inclusive fellowship. And if I'm honest, I'm not really too bothered in what got you here. What I'm interested in, and what I got told, is what are you going to do now you're here? Which is the most important thing. Thankfully, when I got brought here, welcome if you just walked off the streets of Ferndown. You've struck gold. It says in the big book, you've struck gold and we've scratched the limitless load. How much of this do you want? Or are you going to, I've seen many people over the years, sit around the outsides, picking up the crumbs, pecking at this program, and not taking it seriously, the whole deal. And unfortunately, I've been to their funeral. My sobriety date is November the 5th, 2008. So for those that are quick off the maths, it's just over 17 and a bit years. And I don't kind of say that really to impress any of you guys tonight, but what I can tell you is, my family is very happy. My mum will get to sleep at perfect peace and ease tonight. And most importantly as well, Thames Valley Police, they're pretty, they're pretty happy as well. And what's really nice, and some of you know me in here, it's good to see some people, still in this room that continue to come here, that carried a clear-cut message to me, when I first got here. Because my journey is through a treatment centre down the road. The first 5.5 years of my recovery was in Bournemouth. And for that, I will always be eternally grateful. And most importantly, what they didn't do is, those people, some of them are sat in here tonight, they didn't just pat me on the shoulder and say, there, Richie, it's going to be all right. No, it wasn't all right at all. It was not all right at all. You know what I mean? It's very clear in the big book. It says, we need to carry a message of depth and weight. No flim-flam, no half-baked message that is not going to cut it. Do you know what I mean? It says, frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. So don't give me a pat on the back and say it's going to be all right, because I'll just feed straight into that. I got told, you're here now, what are you going to do about it? We suggest potentially you might want to come over here, with us, work some steps, see if your life improves after 6 months, or, as Alan said, there's a tea and coffee, you're more than welcome. But if you're anything like me, or if you're of the type described in the big book on page 21, you're probably just waiting around to use again, which was my experience year after year, time after time. Now I grew up in the era of listening to Ice-T, I've Got the Power, NWA, Fuck the Police, do you know what I mean, and Rage Against the Machine. I was confused. I was one of those guys where, we used to go over or under the fence at Glastonbury Festival. I grew up, smoking Squidgy Black and Soap Bar, scoring off the New Age Travellers back in Oxford, where they're weighing where they're weighing it on the little scales. There weren't no electronic scales then. Do you know what I mean? And some will remember, about 94, 96, the streets were just a wash of kind of, it's Turkish brown tan heroin, and it was game over. It was game over. You know what I mean? It was game over for about 12, 15 years. Do you know what I mean? With a catalogue of errors and many, many tried and failed attempts, to stop and stay stopped, because that is the crux of my problem. If I can break that physical cycle of addiction, I'm one of these guys that, we got 2 or 3 days, I'm feeling a little bit better. I've just done an horrendous detox. I come out, I think I'm doing all right. All of a sudden, the mind will start chattering. I don't know what all the fuss was about. Really? Maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe you can go, maybe, what? You've done really well the last few weeks. You can go and get one of each. It's all right, Rich. The self-justification, the bullshit that goes on in my mind. Because my problem is, that I've got a body when I'm taking drink and drugs kind of creates this elusive feeling where my body just wants more and it wants more. Then I've got this mental obsession, a thought that will outride all other thoughts, that I'm just constantly thinking about where the next drink or drug is coming. I could be sat here with a lump of this and a lump of that. I'm already thinking, where's the next bit coming from? And then, if I can stop, I suffer from an obsession that tells me, just don't use, just don't use, just don't use, just don't use, just don't use. And then I'm using again by the end of the day. You know what I mean? And then if I can break that habitual kind of cycle, I don't know about anyone else, but that's when the real problem starts. You take me away from the drink and drugs, I'm absolutely falling apart inside. You know, I'm falling apart. You know, it's not a good look. But the problem is, I don't have the ability to tell you that's what's happening. You know, I'm restless, irritable, discontent. It talks about in the big book. You know, it's said, you know, I cannot control my emotional natures. You know, I'm sat in a treatment centre down the road nearly 18 years ago. I'm crying over dog food adverts and shit like that. Do you know what I mean? You know, I'm just, oh my God. You know what I mean? You know, and if, you know, I'm on that pick, so I kind of break that cycle. You know, I'm 30, 60 days clean. You know, I'm sat in a treatment centre down the road. You know, all of a sudden, like I say, you know, my head starts giving it, you know, don't know what all the fuss is about. You know, I ring this professional back who's been kind enough to fund me to come down here anyway, which I was very grateful for. And I says to her, you know what, actually, this is not really working for me. You know, I think I need to come back home. I think I need to go back to Cowley, you know, kind of thing. It'd be all right. And she said to me, and I was very offended, and she said, no, you're not welcome back here. There's nothing back here for you anyway. You know, and I thought, oh my God, you know, that's really harsh. Do you know what I mean? You know, but anyway, I managed to, you know, the decision was kind of taken out of my hands. You know, I completed the kind of treatment centre down the road, and thankfully, you know, they shuffled us into kind of 12-step meetings, CAB being one of them, and there were people, as I've spoken about, you know, carrying a clear-cut message. And, you know, thankfully, you know, I had a sponsor, you know, who was armed with the facts. He was very clear with me. You know, he said to me, Richie, I'm a crackhead like you. You know, your dependence is not on me. Your dependence must come from a higher power. You know, I'm a crackhead like you, and I could use tomorrow. And God bless him. Some of you know him. You know, he did at 7.5 years. You know, and ever since that day, bless him, you know, he's back, you know, but he struggled. Do you know what I mean? You know, he fall foul to that first one. And that is what really, you know, happened for me going through the first few chapters of the big book. You know, I got disturbed around the question of alcoholism. You know, and if you're thinking, what's this guy talking about? You know, just read chapter 3, more about alcoholism. Now, if you don't get disturbed around that and think that doesn't really apply to me, then that's your prerogative. You know, I remember when I first looked at that chapter with my sponsor many, many years ago in a little dry house down the road, like a good little sponsee, nodding and that. I can remember as we was going through that chapter and he was breaking it down, he was explaining it to me, he was citing his experiences and I was citing mine. And I can just remember my heart was sinking and my chin was going on the floor, dragging on the floor by the end of it. And I looked him in the eye and I said, I'm fucking in the shit, ain't I? And he said, yes, you are. But, you know, we got a solution for that, you know. And that was the driving force, because it uses words in more about alcoholism around suddenly, you know, not a cloud on the horizon. You know, I vaguely sensed I wasn't being too smart. You know, how many times have you said that to yourself? You know, I related to the jaywalker. You know, keep jumping out in front of those moving cars. It's going to be different this time. You know, making all those sweet promises to my mum. You know, frothy emotional appeal. You know, stood there. And my mum is on her hands and knees, you know, grabbing hold of my leg. You know, looking up at me in the eyes, crying, saying to me, please, son, don't go out tonight, don't go and use. And I'm looking down at my mum, and I love my mum very dearly, thinking, you need to let go of my leg right now. You know, driven by the obsession that I just talked about. You know, that no human power could get in between that, you know. I sat in front of many, many good professionals over my drinking and using career that had my best interests at heart. I can resolutely tell you that, you know, but they could not get me, as it says in the book, from bridge to shore. You know, it was only till I got here, and a good friend of ours says, you know, there's no one with referrals from Cocaine Anonymous. You know, for me, of my type, it was the last throw of the dice. And thankfully, you know, I had some good people, some good mentors, and continue to do, around me that kind of guided me and got me through the steps and connected to that power. You know, and there's some work to be done here, guys. You know, I hear people say, oh yeah, I can't get this stuff. There's nothing to get. You need to do it. There's a whole chapter around into action. This is not into thinking or sitting on our arseholes doing nothing. Do you know what I mean? I haven't got a few years and days under my belt for doing nothing. I made that decision, that deal in the beginning, to go to any lengths. So when my head this afternoon is giving it, you know what, just ring Tony, you're tired, you've had a hard day's work, I don't listen to that. I come here, I turn up and show up, and if there's any one thing, and there ain't no magic bullet, guys, I got to say, if there's one thing that I've remained, even against my best thinking, is consistent and within the middle of the fellowship. I have a home group. The Sunday night big book study in Swindon, you're all welcome there. We don't study the first 104 pages of big book. There's 164 pages of this program. Study out those last few chapters around to the family, to the employers, to the wives, because that for me is really where we're looking at bringing to practicing the principles of this program and all my affairs. And that's the key. You've asked me, how spiritually fit are you today, Richie? I'm going to say, yeah, I'm tip top. I'm absolutely brilliant. Everything is well. Don't ask me. Go and ask my work colleagues, do you know what I mean? Or my loved ones or my closest people. They'll tell you how spiritually fit I am, in this program kind of thing, it takes some work in, and yes, I might have a few years under my belt, but I need to do sometimes more now than when I first walked through the door. And what happens to me now, if I take my foot off the gas, I can go backwards very quickly, and it gets uncomfortable quickly as well. Do you know what I mean? I'm not deluded enough to think, I've got this locked down and this is it. I'm not really up against the Martell bottle with a bit of crack anymore. What I'm up against is my peculiar thinking around a lot of other things. And one of them being is, as I described earlier, so my mind will start telling to me, you've been going to them meetings for 17 and a half years, Rich, just give it a break. You don't need to go there anymore. Don't worry about those sponsors, keep your hand down for sponsorship. There's other people that can do that. Don't go to your home group on Sunday. Just put your commitment, just hand your commitment in. And then, which is probably more nearer to, well, don't go to your home group. Nobody likes you there anyway. And, that's probably more the truth. Nobody likes me anyway, which I don't really care. I'm not here to kind of make, I'm here to save my ass. That's the truth. And, there's deadly earnestness about this. I take this stuff very seriously. Just because, we come into the rooms of cocaine on, I thought the red carpet's going to be rolled out. Oh, there you go, Richie. You're clean now. No. There's a long road and continued road of reconstruction ahead. Do you know what I mean? Which has taken a number of years. There's amends, there's infantry to be written. There's amends to be made. Because the thing is, this is what I said earlier, I'm kind of like, I put the drink and drugs down, I'm doing all right on that pink fluffy cloud, 30, 60, 90 days. Then all of a sudden, do you know what I mean, this big dark cloud comes over my head. For those that don't know, I'm depressed, clean, with no program. And then what happens is, I can see myself in the rearview mirror, and I'm faced head on with the shame, guilt, bitterness and remorse of what has happened in my life up until 33 years old. And that needs to be cleaned out. I need to clean house. I need to trust God. I need to help others. I need to go back and make those amends, And my sponsor's very clear, Richie said, a bumbling sorry is not going to cut it. If you owe the money, pay the money back. And as God is my witness, when I was gainfully employed a couple of years in, there's money coming out of my bank account every month, probably for about 8-9 years, But a man is unthinking, right, if we put financial progress before the spiritual. And funny enough, when I put my faith and trust in God, and lead a spiritual way of life following the directions of this program, Funny enough, the material stuff just comes naturally, doesn't it? You know, now I've got some nice external stuff, you know, but my sponsor's always very clear. That stuff is just on tick. You know, it's not even yours. And trust me, I know he's right, because if I put this program down and leave the fellowship, you know, the Range Rover outside will be smoked very quickly. Do you know what I mean? You know, the other stuff will go. The great career that some of you know I've got will be gone. You know, position of responsibility, gone completely. You know, and I'll be back, you know, if I get back, you know, crawling through the doors of CA. You know, and I've seen it time and time again. Now, you know, I'd be doing the newcomer a disservice saying everything's all happy-go-lucky and I'm singing from the rooftops every day singing hallelujah. No, that's not my experience. But what I can tell you is, you know, this program demands so much less of me than what my drinking and using did, you know. And there will be, as it says in the big book, you know, certain trials and low spots ahead. You know, it kind of says that when all else fails, so what is all else? So when the prayer, the meditation, the infantry, the seeking counsel, it says when all else fails, you know, intensive work, you know, one-on-one book work with another drug addict will save the day. You know, and again, you know, there's people in the room, and my friend Jason coming tonight, that is something I've remained consistent in, you know, is working with others for the last 17 and a half years. And, you know, the fellowship around me now, where I'm from, you know, it's quite a young fellowship. You know, there's probably 3 or 4 of us with like 15 plus years. And it can be a lonely place sometimes. That's the truth. You know, now I don't really get the brand newcomers still smelling of cocaine and crack to work with. You know, I get the real sick lads that are kind of like, you know, 5, 10, 15 years in that are just bent out of shape, clean and sober. Because trust me, you know, that can happen. You know, and I get them, and it's like, that's all right, it's cool. You know, I identify. You know, I've been there myself. I've been through those pigs and troughs throughout recovery. You know, and you know, my whole life, you know, I've had a complete change of heart and a transformation in my thinking that has moved me from a complete position of hopelessness to recovered. You know, I no longer wake up in that dread. You know, the hideous 4 horsemen, you know, it's gone, go away, you know, kind of thing. And that is all down to this program, remaining consistent. You know, I don't really go anywhere else. That's the truth. Why would I need to? You know, and, you know, I think this might piss some people off, but you're not going to hear out of my mouth, just keep coming back. You know, you're kind of here now. And as I said, you know, what are you going to do about it? Because there's thousands of people out there that won't even get the chance that you guys have got in this room tonight. You know what, my mouth is drying up. That's got to be 15, 20 minutes. So again, go on over it. So again, Tony, thank you for asking me to share. It's great to be in Ferndown tonight. Hope somebody got something for that. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Richie.